The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Yo, Philly, how you's doing? Welcome to Philadelphia Baseball, past, present, and personal. I'm Bill Kashadis, your host on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. This week, I'm pleased to have as my guest Neil Lenkto, Professor of Modern American History at the University of Delaware. Neil is also the author of 3 highly acclaimed baseball books, Campy, The 2 Lives of Roy Campanella, published by Simon & Schuster in 2011, Negro League Baseball, The Rise and Ruin of a Black Institution, published by the University of Pennsylvania in 2004, which was awarded the coveted Seymour Medal by the Society for American Baseball Research, and Fair Dealing and Clean Playing, The Hilldale Club, and the Development of Black Professional Baseball, 1910 to 1932, which was published by McFarland in 1994. Welcome to the program, Neil.
Nice to have you. Thanks for having me.
Let's begin with you. Your first book, Fair Dealing and Clean Playing, was on the Hilldales, who won the 1925 Negro League World Series. Why did you start writing about Negro League baseball when you're a professor of modern American history? I mean, what inspired your interest in that particular topic?
I mean, it actually stems back to my own love of baseball as growing up. I grew up in New England, so I was a Red Sox fan. Boo, sorry. But it's really the two things, being a baseball fan and being a history buff. And when I went to graduate school, I was given an opportunity by a professor to do a paper on some area of modern history, and I thought about doing something baseball-related. And what drew me to the Negro Leagues is that I had done some work when I got out of undergraduate school for John Holloway. I don't know if that's a name that means anything to you.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Right. John Holloway sort of one of the first to do a lot of interviews with Negro Leaguers and also did some preliminary statistical work. And he was looking for someone in the Philadelphia area to basically go to the free library and photocopy old African-American newspapers and get the game accounts for Negro League games. And I didn't really know much about the Negro Leagues at all at that point. So that was my first exposure. So when it came time to do this seminar paper in graduate school, I kind of thought back to that and how interesting I had found it and how fascinating it was that there was this whole separate, not only baseball life, but African-American life that I didn't really know too much about. So that's what got me started. I remember trying to think of something to do with the Negro Leagues. And then as I started doing research, I realized, well, I better limit this to something local. And I remember, okay, there's a team called Hilldale. I've heard of them. So I did like a seminar paper on Hilldale, and that's what got me started. And also what I think I was attracted to was that there was a large collection on the Hilldale Club at the African American Museum in Philadelphia. So once I started doing that, I got more into it for the seminar paper, and then it became my master's thesis, and from there it became my first book. So that's how it started. It was kind of a circuitous route. As I said, I really didn't know anything at all about the Negro Leagues. I was a baseball fanatic, but didn't know much about the Negro Leagues beyond the usual Satchel Paige, Josh Gibson type stuff until I had that class and also working with John Holloway.
Who was the thesis advisor?
Alan Davis.
Alan Davis. He was at Penn or Temple?
It's Temple. He was actually, Alan I think is still with us. He's pretty old at this point, but he was known for doing work with social workers. He wrote a book on Jane Addams and things like that. But he always loved Philadelphia history. I mean, he was very into Philly history. I think he encouraged me to do something with the paper. And he said, maybe you can get this published. So I got the seminar paper became the thesis, which became published as a journal article in the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography. And then from there, it got expanded to a book for McFarland, although originally it was actually going to be published by, I don't even know if you've heard of this publisher called Meckler Books. They were out of Connecticut.
Yeah, very brief.
A couple of his books done with Meckler, and in the middle of doing this book for them, Meckler basically said, we're not really doing much anymore, and we can't do your book. So I remember at the time, this was back in the early 90s, kind of frantically trying to find a publisher. At that point, there was not that much interest in any kind of Negro League stuff, and thankfully McFarland in North Carolina was interested enough to publish it, and I was quite grateful to them. I think they did a decent job with it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is Holloway still around?
As far as I know, I haven't heard from him in a few years. He used to email me once in a while, but he's got to be up in his 80s. I don't think he's published anything in a while. I mean, for a while he was, you'd still hear from him for Negro League stuff, but I don't think he's doing much work in it anymore. At least I'm guessing. I just not really seen much from him in a while.
Yeah, he pretty much. I relate him with Pittsburgh, the Negro Leagues in Pittsburgh, the Crawfords and the Homestead Grays, and I think the last book I saw of his again was Meckler, and it was Satch and Josh, or Josh and Satch.
Yes, he did do that book. I mean, what Holloway really deserves credit for more than anything is that back in the 70s, when no one really was paying attention to the Negro Leagues, he went out there and interviewed all these players. I mean, he's kind of like who did the Glory of Their Times, Lawrence, the old
Ritter.
time. Yeah, Ritter, thank you. He's really the Negro League Lawrence Ritter, because without those interviews, their memories would be lost. I mean, no one was doing it. I mean, Peterson did some for his book, Robert Peterson, for Only the Ball Was White, but Holloway did pretty extensive interviews with guys who had been forgotten, and so we're really very in debt to him for that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. You said you grew up in New England as a Red Sox fan, and obviously Philadelphia and Boston have one thing in common, and that is they were the last two teams in the major leagues to integrate. Boston, I guess, had Pumpsie Green they finally signed.
Green, yes.
And then Philadelphia signed John Kennedy in, my God, what was it, 59 or 60 or something like that. So were you familiar with that rather infamous Red Sox history?
I mean, I think vaguely at the time. I mean, I remember when I was, when I was a kid, you'd occasionally see stories of stuff going on in Florida, like spring training incidents of racism. I remember, I think at one time, I think it was Tommy Harper, who was a Red Sox coach. It was something with him, some kind of. I mean, so it was always this undercurrent, and certainly the Red Sox were known at the time for not having that many African American players. It wasn't until later I think people really started examining it more closely, and that was after I had left the area. But it's interesting you say that, because now there's actually the Red Sox are pushing to rename Yawkey Way outside of Fenway Park, to remove the name Tom Yawkey. I mean, I think they're trying to expunge him from their history. But I mean, the same thing could be probably said for the Phillies and Bob Carpenter.
Oh yeah,
was no racial progressive either. But I always try to say I don't think they were that exceptional. I think most of those guys, the vast majority of the hierarchy in Major League Baseball in the 40s and into the 50s were not interested in integration, and basically reflected that kind of attitude. So I mean, Yawkey and Carpenter look bad, of course, by modern perspective, but they really weren't that different from the rest of the owners.
Yeah, the old Philadelphia Stars who were with us, I think the longest, people like Stanley Glenn and Malin Duckett and Gene Benson and people like that, they had a saying, and the saying was, it was a matter of dollars and cents. That's what integration was all about. And I think they had it right. I mean, the white clubs integrated because they knew that they could profit financially on Negro League Baseball. But, that takes me back to your work. Fair dealing and clean playing is really about Ed Bolden, a postal worker who grew that Hilldale Club from a boys' club in Derby to a major power in the Negro Leagues. And I'm wondering if you could summarize for us how he did that. I mean, what was that process like?
Yeah, it's a really, actually very interesting story. I mean, it was an era in the early 1900s where every corner of every town had a team, had a sandlot team. So in Philadelphia and the Philadelphia region, there were just hundreds and hundreds of amateur teams, and they play every Saturday pretty much, and there's no Sunday baseball in those days allowed. But, I mean, it's funny if you look in the Philadelphia Inquirer in those days on Sundays, and they have their scores of the Saturday game, just pages and pages of games of all these amateur teams. And that was the environment that the Hilldale Club came out of. They were just a group of guys, kids basically, I think between like maybe 15 and 19, playing in Delaware County. Bolden loved baseball. He got involved with them, and he had a desire to sort of make them better, and every year they would get a little bit better in the amateur world. And then he started to import professionals, and he incorporated the team, and they just got bigger and bigger until they eventually became the major Eastern club, and they were making huge amounts of money for the time in the Negro Leagues. And part of that was because of the whole Philadelphia market, which was a baseball-crazy market, but also baseball-crazy among African Americans. So they did very, very well into the 20s and were part of the first Eastern Professional League, Eastern Color League. Bolden was behind the organization of that entity. But, you know, when the Depression came, that pretty much delayed their progress a great deal, and then Bolden ended up being pushed out, and a new owner came in, and then by 32, when the Depression was really bad, the club collapsed. But they really had a remarkable 20-year run, and I think Bolden is really a seminal figure. I still think he should be in the Philadelphia Sports Hall of Fame. I don't know why he isn't.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So use your advocacy on this program. We got to get him into that Sports Hall of Fame.
No, absolutely. I mean, he is one of the forgotten ones.
He's kind of the Black Connie Mack. I mean, you think, Connie Mack was involved with the Philadelphia Athletics for 50 years. Well, Bolden was involved in African-American baseball, professional baseball, for 40 years, from like 1910 till he died in 1950, because he was involved with the successor team in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Stars, which you just mentioned.
Mm-hmm. You point out in the book that the Hilldales won the first 3 Eastern Colored League pennants beginning in 1923, and in 1925 they won the second Colored World Series, and you have some real wonderful vignettes of future Hall of Famers in the book: Judy Johnson, Oscar Charleston, Biz Mackey, and Louis Santop. You know, one thing that I'm so curious about is why hasn't Hilldale gotten the same top billing as the Kansas City Monarchs or the Homestead Grays with that kind of success and those types of players?
I mean, my guess is because they didn't persist beyond 1932. So, I mean, the Grays were around for a long time. The Grays started in the Hilldale era and went on to the late 40s, and the Monarchs, of course, had a longer run. So I think that's probably helped them. But I would agree that Hilldale has gotten short shrift. I think Philadelphia in general has gotten short shrift with the Negro Leagues. I mean, they're far more important than, say, Pittsburgh, but, Pittsburgh is always touted to the sky as the Negro League center, when as a market, as a financial market, they really weren't. I mean, the Homestead Grays did much of their playing in Washington, D.C., and the Pittsburgh Crawfords only lasted about 5 or 6 years. So, I mean, Philadelphia was a rabid scene for Negro League baseball for 35, 40 years, and I think it's never really received its due in that regard.
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, in addition to the Hilldales, you had the Pythians, who were one of the earliest black teams, 1865. They've gotten a little play now because of the dedication of the Octavius Cato statue. You had the Philadelphia Giants. You had the Hilldales, the Stars. Yeah, you had some great teams here, and you're absolutely right. They just have not gotten the play that these other clubs have, and it's a shame. Now, your next book, Negro League Baseball: The Rise and Ruin of a Black Institution, was published by Penn Press in 2004, and won the Seymour Award. In my estimation, and I think in the estimation of many folks who have read it, it is the most comprehensive account of the business side of black baseball from 1933 through the early 1960s. So in a way, it's kind of a sequel, a natural sequel to Fair Dealing and Clean Playing. You reveal some of the nastiest rivalries between owners and leagues in that book. You also have some real interesting stories of how many of the best players jumped from one team to the next based on which club offered the best salary. Now, I'm wondering, with those kinds of obstacles, how on earth did the Negro Leagues manage to survive for such a long time, especially during the Great Depression when blacks had little, if any, discretionary income to attend baseball games, or the owners really to sponsor teams?
Well, I think that's a really good question. I think in some ways that's the theme of the book. I mean, there's a lot going on in that book. It is comprehensive, perhaps too comprehensive at times. But I think the takeaway when you read that book and when I did the research was it is amazing how they lasted as long as they did. The leagues were poorly run. I mean, there's no getting around it. Part of it was financial. They just did not have the money to do the things that they wanted to do. But I think another problem, and again, as you mentioned, the feuds between the owners, is that the owners themselves were usually just looking out for themselves, and they weren't thinking of how to build this organization into something profitable and something successful. It was sort of how much can we squeeze out of it. And I think they were satisfied to do that as long as they didn't have any kind of competition. In other words, because it was a segregated world and Major League Baseball would not accept African Americans, the Negro League owners knew that black fans were going to show up for their games. And so if they ran a sort of, half-baked league on a shoestring, they still wouldn't get black fans to show up. So they weren't really motivated to fix some of these problems. Once integration comes in 1945 with the signing of Jackie Robinson, then the two leagues, the Negro National, Negro American, start scrambling to try to fix their problems and fix their contract issues and things like that, but it's too late. So it is astounding that it lasted as long as it did. I think it says something more about the talent of the league that was so good that fans would want to see it regardless of some of the issues in the organization. And also it says something about the black fans themselves who love baseball so much they would overlook some of these flaws and come out and support it.
Mm-hmm. Now, Neil, I have to admit that I baited you with my first question. I know exactly why an American historian writes baseball, because I do. And I like your writing because you write in context. I mean, you're one of the historians, true baseball historians, that understands the interplay between baseball and American history. And it's a signature of every book that you've written. But the other signature, and one I really admire, is that you exhaustively research your topics. And the Negro Leagues book is a fine example of that. I mean, you've based the book on primary source documents from the collections of the National Baseball Hall of Fame Library, the NAACP, the Library of Congress, and the National Archives. Then, after reviewing the 78 pages of endnotes you have, I think I've never done that. I've hit 60, but not 78 pages of endnotes. But after reviewing those pages, it appears to me as if you've read every single newspaper account of every Negro League game that was ever written. Now, that's impressive of itself, since I think
I did that. I mean, some of it was crazy when I look back at it now. But I think I was driven because there was just not that much written about the Negro Leagues in a historical fashion, and I felt, all right, I'm going to try to get the story straight. I'm going to try to read everything there is, and also in that way figure out what's wrong with what's been written before.
Right.
So I think I had that. I was kind of just like going out into the wilderness and trying to, I'm just going to read everything and see what's out there. That being said, I think sports, and you can attest to this. You've obviously written several wonderful books. Sports history is more difficult because there's just, in most cases, not as many primary sources available beyond, say, newspapers and magazines. We're rarely blessed with extensive collections of, say, correspondence or diaries and things like that, because unfortunately, sports organizations and teams and clubs and leagues have been very poor about saving their records.
Mm-hmm.
Luckily, there were some really good collections for the Negro Leagues. Probably the best one in writing that book was the Effa Manley papers. And Effa Manley, for your listeners, co-owned the Newark Eagles with her husband, Abe Manley. And I believe, if I remember the story correctly, these records were discovered perhaps in the 70s, I think in someone's house, like just a file cabinet full of records. And what these records are good for is because they pretty much have 6 or 7 years of team correspondence between most of the owners, and that stuff was really useful in writing that book.
Yeah. For listeners, by the way, Effa Manley is the only female in the National Baseball Hall of Fame.
Is that right?
Yeah, and she's
Philadelphia.
Yes,
I guess that would be correct when I think of it.
Yeah. Rachel Robinson has been given an honorary membership, but she doesn't have a plaque. Effa Manley does. And by the way, Effa Manley was Philadelphia born and bred.
Wasn't she born in South Philly or Germantown or something like that?
Yeah. Yep. One of the interesting things for me about reading that book is how you were able to resolve the inevitable discrepancies you must have come across, because, as you've already said, baseball coverage of the Negro Leagues is notorious for being incomplete. It's extremely biased and often contradictory. So if you erred on one side or another, where did you err? On the side of primary source documents, writings or records of clubs or records of leagues, or how did you reconcile the differences that you must have come across?
I would say I preferred primary sources, written sources, when I could get them. Interviews are good too, but I think interviews way after the fact are often a little bit more questionable. I mean, you've obviously done oral history like I have. You're dealing with people's memories, which can change over time, or they get confused. So, if I could corroborate something, with multiple sources, I tried to, but some things we'll just never know. You have to just speculate. Occasionally, I'd find something. I remember I was able to track down some legal cases, and that opened up some interesting information. So sometimes you could find, a little stray primary source here and there, but I've always hoped that some more primary sources would materialize on the Negro Leagues, but unfortunately they have not. I remember when the Hall of Fame did the Negro League project back in the early 2000s, and there was sort of a general solicitation trying to see if any new primary sources might surface, but they really didn't. So, I mean, basically we're left with a few very small collections of primary source documents on the Negro Leagues. And as I said, the Hilldale collection at the African American Museum in Philadelphia is one of the best, and probably the Manley collection, which has been microfilmed, is available for researchers also. But that's about it. I mean, that's like nothing when you look at other areas of American history where there's thousands of pages of documents to sift through, whereas with this subject there really isn't that much.
Now, you seem to make a natural transition between your topics. I mean, Fair Dealing, Clean Playing was about the Hilldale Club and Ed Bolden, his management and the economics of it, which segued into, it seems, your book on the Negro Leagues. And, obviously one of the greatest players in the Negro Leagues, and even better when he reached the majors, was Roy Campanella. So I'm assuming that, one topic led to another, but your read on Campanella is particularly interesting because, as the title suggests, you address Campanella's two lives. The first makes up the bulk of the book, obviously. It focused on his 20-year baseball career. But the second life actually, to me, was more fascinating. It's based on the 35 years he spent in a wheelchair as a paraplegic after his New Year's Eve 1957 car crash ended that career. what were some of the insights that you got out of that second life? Actually, let me take a step back. Which of the lives were more appealing to you to write about?
Well, it's funny you mentioned the two lives. That was not my title. That was the publisher's title. And people have asked me, well, does that mean his two lives, meaning there's the side he presents to the public versus his private side? Does that mean his life in the Negro Leagues versus his life in the major leagues? Or does that mean, as you just stated, his life in the wheelchair and outside of the wheelchair? I guess it can mean whatever you want it to mean. I tend to think it's more of the two lives, I guess, the in and out of the wheelchair. I think the interesting things about Campanella is that there was a different side to him. I remember when I was telling my brother, who's also a huge baseball fan, that I was going to do a book on Campanella, and he said, well, you better find some dirt on him because everyone thinks of him as so nice and friendly. If you get 400 pages of that, it's not going to be much of a book. And I didn't set out to, find tawdry information about him, but I ended up, I think, portraying him in a more three-dimensional way than he's usually seen as. Typically, I think most people have envision Campanella as a happy-go-lucky, I love baseball kind of guy, which he was, but there was also a darker side to him and a side that was frustrated about his lot in life and his obviously about his situation with Jackie Robinson. So I think I uncovered some interesting aspects of his life and what he went through as an African American and as someone who was biracial. So I think those are some of the themes I touched on in this book. And also the extraordinary baseball career he had of someone who played baseball from age of 15 in 1937 until he was paralyzed in that car accident. He never stopped playing. I mean, he had an amazing career, went everywhere, played everywhere, and saw everything in the baseball world you could see.
Mm-hmm. The thing that fascinated me about the book, it really resonated to the point where I really wanted to delve into these aspects, was the conflict with Robinson, which really not many people knew about, even at the time. Also the fact that he was a ladies' man. I mean, I don't believe he was married to the first person that he had a child with or two daughters with, and he disowned them. And that was one of the reasons, frankly, Branch Rickey didn't want to make him the first player, in addition to, the fact that it would be twice the burden for a catcher to come in and, call signals to white pitchers, which would just make it even worse on him than with Robinson. But, a lot of that stuff, you pointed out in the book, and it really piqued my curiosity, to do a dual biography on the two. And it really is a tough assignment because so much had been written about Campanella. I mean, he did his own autobiography, It's Good to Be Alive, and I think there was another book that had been written about him years ago. There was juvenile literature on him. But there was never really a scholarly biography until your book, which I think really gave a very, very balanced treatment of him.
He's a difficult subject in that, I think I mentioned this in the book, he's someone who never told the same story, the story the same way twice. So he was a great storyteller, would tell all kinds of wonderful anecdotes about his career and his life. But when you start putting them all together, you see how there's little differences in them each time. So it was hard to corroborate some of his stories. And it was a book that did rely quite a bit on certainly on what was out there written about him, primary source-wise, but also interviews, people I was fortunate enough to interview before they died. I mean, even when I was writing the book, and you can relate to this too, doing this, when you were working on some of the same stuff, a lot of these players were up in their 80s, and some of them just were dying before I had a chance to get to them. I think Johnny Padres was one who I was trying to get a hold of. There were a few others who I just couldn't get them in time. And I know they probably would have had some interesting stories to tell me if they were willing to talk. I mean, some people are obviously not willing to talk, but these days there's very few Brooklyn Dodgers even left. I mean, I think there's probably a handful at this point who would even be able to speak intelligently about him. Carl Erskine is still alive. I guess he's about 90-something at this point.
He is.
But there aren't many of the real boys of summer around anymore.
Yeah, I was very fortunate in my book. Monty Irvin was a tremendous help. So was Padres. Erskine. Willie Mays didn't want to have anything to do with me, wouldn't talk with me. Newcomb would only talk if I paid him $5,000, which didn't go anywhere. So yeah, there were, and I missed Brancato. I wish I had known about Brancato. For some reason, I didn't think he was around, and I didn't pursue, to check that.
The only reason I think I found him was that a friend of mine, Dad, knew him fairly well, and at one point she says, "Oh yeah, my father's friend's name Al." I was like, "That's Al Brancato." She said, "Yeah." So I was able to talk to him. I think his memory was starting to go. I didn't get that much out of him. I mean, some of these guys again are getting up there in years. But yeah, Monty Irvin was very good for me too. I mean, he was extremely thoughtful in his responses and a lot of very fascinating things to say. So he was someone I think was still sharp as a tack to the very end. He was a really, really good guy to talk to.
I can't remember. Did you have the opportunity to interview Campanella's children or Rachel Robinson or Sharon Robinson?
I did speak to Rachel Robinson. The Campanella children, I was in contact with them for a while, but they just finally, Roy Jr. just basically pulled the plug and would not cooperate. I think they wanted a book where they could control the content, and they probably would have let me talk to them if they could, sanction what went in and what went out. So I never did get anything out of them. I did speak to a grandchild who was pretty helpful, but as far as the immediate family, I was not, which I think was a shortcoming. I wish I'd been able to talk to them, but that's, you can't always get what you want with these interviews. So.
Oh, I hear you. Well, Neil, I can't end the interview without asking you about the tremendous success that you've had as a writer and in really such a short amount of time. When you say, less than 2 decades, that sounds like a lot of time to our young listeners. It really isn't. And in less than 2 decades, you've written and published 3 highly acclaimed books and progressed from a small library publisher in McFarland to one of the most prominent, one of the best publishing houses in the nation with Simon & Schuster. In addition, one of those 3 books, the one on the Negro Leagues, is considered a groundbreaking work, such a groundbreaking work that the Society of Baseball Research awarded it the Seymour Medal, one of the most prestigious baseball writing awards. There are very, very few writers in any field, I don't care if you're talking about baseball, American history, or poetry, who have that kind of success. To what do you attribute that kind of remarkable success?
Well, that's very kind of you to say. It seems like it's a lot longer also. When I think back of the Hilldale book was 20 years ago, but I guess in some ways it's not. I don't know. I think, it's you have to have a passion for the subject and you have to be interested in what you're writing about. I think that helps. And I think you have to be a little bit, to be a good researcher, you got to be like a detective and have that kind of, nose to the grindstone, dogged attitude, which I think I've always had. So I think that's helped as well. And I think it's just, writing, I think it's practice. I think my writing has gotten better with each book, but I think it's just a matter of, developing your writing muscle. And anyone who's out there listening who's interested in writing, that's what I would advise you to do, is write as much as you can. And I think that helps you get better. I think the publishing world today is difficult. It's probably getting worse these days because of what's going on with a lot of books. So it's a tough field, and I guess I should feel fortunate that I've been able to have as much success as I've had. But I sometimes I wonder where the publishing world's going to be in 10, 15 years, and whether the opportunities to publish will be there anymore, or it's all going to be, if you have, I don't know if anyone would publish, say, a book on the Negro Leagues today like they've been willing to do back in the 90s, something like a Hillsdale book.
Mm-hmm.
The monograph, I think, is starting to disappear to a certain degree. I mean, I think university presses are having a harder time. I think even the big houses in New York, like say Simon & Schuster, I think they're cutting down their list as well. So it's hard. It's definitely hard. But as I said, I think it's rewarding also.
Now you, I've heard, are coming out with another book, which I've heard is on the verge of coming out. It's on World War I?
Yes, I'm actually doing a totally different move. I mean, it kind of plays off what I just said to you. With the Campanella book, which I felt was a pretty good book and got very good reviews, and just the interest, the sales interest, I think wasn't that great. Some of it I chalk up to I think it was not promoted very well. But it also led me to think more about what I'm going to do next. And again, I'm sure you've experienced this as well. You spend a lot of time on these books, and you find the audience is not that large. I mean, we love baseball. We expect lots of people out in the world love baseball, but the actual people who love baseball and go buy baseball books is not as large as I think we'd like it to be. So I decided I'm going to try something different and try to do something more general interest history. So I'm doing this book, which I'm kind of behind in, but I'm working on it. I actually wrote today. It's about America's entry into World War I, and it's going to be told through three important figures: President Woodrow Wilson, his rival Theodore Roosevelt, and the leading peace advocate in the nation, Jane Addams. So that's the way the book is going to be structured. As I said, I think part of the reason was, as I said, I felt that baseball, as much as I love it, it just doesn't seem to be. It's just hard to get people to read it. And if I want to continue publishing with larger publishing houses, I figured I'd try something different. So I may go back to baseball. I love baseball. I wouldn't mind writing about it again, but that's where I am right now at the moment.
Well, that's a great topic, and I know exactly how you feel. I live in the 19th century for the other type of writing that I do, and I'm right now just finishing up a book on William Still, who was an Underground Railroad agent in Philadelphia.
Oh, yes,
and years ago I began to put together a database which amounted to 995 runaway slaves who came through Philadelphia, and he interviewed and told their stories in his book, Underground Railroad, that was published in 1872. And it was a chore because the book is not indexed. And in addition, he had another journal called Journal C that's at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. So it took me just 5 years to do that database. And I put it out there. I did a multivariate analysis of it and wrote it up. No one wanted it, but said, if you're willing to write a biography on Still, then we'd look at it. So 20 years later now, I'm finally finishing up that manuscript, and hopefully the interest will be there. So, we'll see. But that's what I end up doing, shifting between baseball and my other interests in 19th century American history, which is mostly African American history.
Well, that sounds great. I'm looking forward to seeing that book.
Well, anyway, I wish you luck with that, Neil. And you are a very gifted writer and one who has contributed a wealth of insight in our understanding of Negro League baseball. And many of us who love the game are extremely grateful for that. And thanks for being with us tonight.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you, Philly fans, for tuning in. See you next week for another podcast of Philadelphia baseball, past, present, and personal. This is Bill Cachetis, rounding third and heading home on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network.